Okay, we're going to talk about factoring methods today. Greatest common factors are what we need to look at first, and they're commonly known as GCF. I like to have them be known as the eyeball. I always point to my eye, GCF, looking for your greatest common factor, is one of the easiest things to do, but the most commonly forgotten. So it's the first thing that you always do every single time that you need to factor. Look with your eyeball, GCF. First one is we're going to factor 3p cubed, q to the 7th, minus 12p to the 5th, q to the 4th. I look at that, it looks very complicated. I'm looking for factors, things that multiply together, that are going to give me that ultimately if I were to multiply them back out. First thing you look at is the numbers, your leading coefficient. Is there something that is in common to both, the greatest common factor that I can take out of both terms, or if you will, divide each term by? I can, as you can see here, I can take a 3 out of the 3 and the 12. Then you look at your terms here. And you say, okay, in each term, with my variables, is there anything else I can divide out then of this? And I look and I have a p cubed and a p to the 5th. I know I can factor the p to the cubed out, and it will factor out of both. And on the q to the 7th, I can take a q to the 4th out of the q to the 7th and the q to the 4th. So what I do is I take the 3 out, the p to the cubed out, and the q to the 4th. Then I make a parentheses. Now notice I have two terms. When I factor out this term out of both of them, I'm going to end up with two terms back in my parentheses. And it's always good to check when you're done to see if you end up with that term when you're finished. So I have this taken out. I'm dividing each term by that. When I take this term here and I divide it by this term, I notice I have a q to the 3rd left. You keep the sign the same. Now I take this term and then divide it by that, or I'm factoring it out, and I notice I have a 4 left and a p squared. Now I have a term and a term. Those are the factors of that binomial. If you need to check, which I suggest that you do, is you go through and multiply it back through, you'll notice you'll end up with the same that you started with. Okay? Let's look at this one. It's a little bit longer. I want to factor 18a squared b to the 4th plus 27 b to the 5th c to the 4th minus 36 a to the 4th b cubed c squared. So I looked at all three of these numbers here. I noticed I could take a 9 out, and then I looked at all my variables and noticed I could take a b cubed out. I really couldn't take an a squared out of anything because this term didn't have it, and I could take a c out of both of these but not this, so I can't take that out. So I'm going to take that out right here. Make your parentheses big, and I notice I'm going to have three terms. I'm going to have three terms in my parentheses. So when I factor this out, I end up with a 2a squared b plus 3b squared c to the 4th minus 4, because the 36 divided by 9 is 4, a to the 4th c squared. And if I were to multiply that back through with a distributive property, I would end up with what I started with. That's what I call GCF, using your eyeball, pulling out the greatest common factor in each term to factor it out. Okay, this is one of my favorites. It's called the difference of two perfect squares. You've probably heard of it as front seat, back seat. And you're going to get both terms of your binomial are going to be perfect squares. And notice it says the difference of two perfect squares. This only works if you have subtraction. Addition, it does not work for. So I have the difference of two perfect squares, so you're going to have something squared minus something squared. You'll notice this won't have a middle term to it, and when you go to factor it, you'll notice you're going to have the exact same thing in the parentheses. You're going to take the square root of this and the square root of that, put it here, and put it there, and just put a plus minus in the middle. Okay? Let's try this one right here. So I look at it and I notice 16 is a perfect square, 25 is a perfect square, x squared is perfect squared, and so is y. So I know I can set it up using two parentheses, just like that. Look at your first term right here. How did I get 16x squared? Well, if I take the square root of that, it's going to be 4 and 4, and x squared is x and x. So that first term came from 4x times 4x, and it's a perfect square. The same goes for the 25y squared. I can put a 5y here and a 5y here. And all I have to do now is a plus and a minus, or a minus and a plus. It doesn't matter as long as the second term disappears. Okay? Let's try this one. And I picked fractions for a reason. I looked at it, and this is a perfect square, and so are these perfect squares, and they're fractions, but it doesn't make any difference. So I'm going to set up my two parentheses like I showed you. Okay? So now I look at that and say, well, the square root of both of that would be 5/7 x. So that goes here, because that's a perfect square. And this would be 10 over 11, because that's y. And then I just put the plus and the minus. That's the difference of two perfect squares. That's my favorite. Okay, let's factor some trinomials. We're going to start with a leading coefficient of 1, which basically means all these are just going to be plain old x squareds. But they're trinomials, and there's no, the only thing in front of my leading coefficient, it's a 1. So what you need to do is you need to look for factors of your last term whose sum is equal to the coefficient of the middle term, and you can leave it with two parentheses. All right? So what goes in your parentheses is always what happens to your first term and your last term. So when I do my parentheses, and I get all done doing these, this first term is broken down here. How did you get it? This last term is broken down here. So the easy part is looking at this and saying, okay, how did I get an x squared? Well, I know that's going to be x times x. That's easy. So I've got the first circle done. It's in there. Now what you have to do now is you have to look at your last term. Now I should have included the sign with that, but I have to look for factors of a positive 8 that will give me a negative 6. So over here I kind of set it up. I've got to find factors of positive 8. So I can have 1 times 8 or 2 times 4. Those are the only factors I know. So I have to look at which group of these factors are going to add up to a negative 6. It's a negative 6. So I said, oh, I could also have negative 1 times negative 8. That would give me a positive 8. I also could have negative 2 times negative 4 for factors. And if I look, I see these two right here will add up to negative 6. So those are the two I'm going to use. So I'm going to put them here. Now if you look, negative 2 times negative 4 is a positive 8 that add up to the negative 6. And you can always check by multiplying it through in your head. You got x squared minus 4x minus 2x plus 8, and it comes out to that. Okay. I even have seen people where they make this x, big X here. They put, oh, I have to find a positive 8 factors of that are going to add up to a negative 6. But you still have to look for all the factors, and I can say, oh, negative 2 times negative 4. They multiply to a positive 8, and they add to a negative 6. And I've seen that's very effective too. But you still have to look at all the factors to see which ones will work in this case. All right? Let's look at this one right here. I've got y squared plus 3y minus 10. So I know, oh, and the first thing you should always do is look with your eyeball and see, is there anything I can pull out of that, anything I can factor out? If you can't, then we're going to go right to two parentheses, and there's nothing I can. That is the beginning of the term. That's the end of my factors. Okay, so I look at here, y squared. How do I get y squared? Y. That goes in the first spot. All right? Now, how do I get negative 10? So I have to find factors of negative 10 that add up to a positive 3. So I have 1 times negative 10, 2 times 5, and either one could be negative. So I can say 2 times negative 5, or negative 2 times a positive 5. And this could be negative 1 times a positive 10. So I've got all these factors I could use. And which ones are going to add up to a positive 3? Well, it's going to be these two right here. And so I said, okay, negative 2 times a positive 5. And there I go. I have my negative 10. Now let's try this again. Y squared plus 5y minus 2y. There's my 3y. Negative 2 times a positive 5 is negative 10. We factored it. Now, I put this one in here on purpose because I have, everybody looks at that middle and they they immediately go, what am I going to do with that? If you just worry about the first circle and the last circle, the middle, if you worry about the number, the middle term will take care of itself. So I have to find what makes an x squared. I have to find out what makes a negative 24y squared. So when I set up my two parentheses, I'm going to make it a little easy on myself. And I said, okay, how do I do the x squared? Well, that's easy. I got x times x. Okay? The negative 24, I know I have to do factors of, so I'm going to wait for a minute to do that. So what I'm going to do now is, I see I have a y squared here. So I'm just going to put the y here, because I know that I had to have a y and a y. Okay? And then we can do our number and put that in there. So let's look for factors of a negative 24 that have to add up to a positive 5. All right? So I have 1 times 24, obviously. Then we get 2 times 12. Let's just do the numbers without the signs. Then I have 3 times 8. And I'm going to stop right here, even though I can go 4 times 6. But I see the 3 times 8, there's something going on where I can do something with a 5. So I said, okay, I have to have a positive 5, and that's got to be a negative 24. So I could have negative 3 times a positive 8. That would add up to a 5 and multiply to a negative 24. So this is what I'm going to use for my factor. So I'm going to put a negative 3y plus 8y. Right? Now if you look at this, you're like, how is that xy going to happen? So watch when you multiply that. You say x times x is x squared. X times 8y is 8xy. There you go. And then this is minus 3xy. Even though this is yx, you can put them the other way. So I have 8xy minus 3xy. There's my 5xy. And then there's my negative 24y squared. All right. Let's talk about factoring trinomials with the leading coefficient other than 1. If you look at it here, notice what's in front of the x squared is something other than a 1. I have a 2 and a 6 there. Now, the first method, I'm using 2 problems. I'm going to use them over again. I call this trial and error. This is how I kind of learned it when I was in school. Do I prescribe to it? After a while, you'll get really good at this, and sometimes you can do it trial and error. I'm going to show you another method after this that works every single time. But I still want to show it to you how you can do trial and error. Trial and error is the same type of thing that we did before, but you're going to have to play around with it. You're going to be doing some erasing, and I might even have to fix it with this. So I look at it and say, okay, this is the beginning of my parenthesis, and this is the end of those parentheses. So I'm going to set them up. Okay? And I say, how do I get 2x squared? Well, that's an easy one because it's 2 times 1. So I can say, oh, I had a 2x and an x. And I've kind of taken care of that 2x squared. But that 2, you've got to take into consideration when you do your middle term. So I'm going to do some factors of negative 4. I have 1 times negative 4. I have 2 times negative 2. And I could say 4 times negative 1. All those combinations will work. I have to get a positive 7. So when you look at this, you say, I don't see a 7. The reason why you don't is because you have that 2 there, so you have to kind of play around with it. Now, I know that I have to get a 7. So if you take those numbers, and let's try the 1 and negative 4. If I were to put the 1 here and the negative 4 here, okay, let's just try it, a 1 and a negative 4 here. When I multiply this out, I'm going to get, for my middle term, negative 8x plus 1x. That's a negative 7x. Oh, I'm close. I don't want a negative 7x. I want a positive. So all I have to do, basically, I was lucky on my first time, is to shift my signs and see if that works. So if it's 2x squared here, plus 8x minus 1x, there's my 7x, and there's my negative 4. So by guessing and checking, I just so happened to pick that first one, and I realized that I had to switch my signs. So this ends up being the factors that I need. And the other thing that's different than what we've done before is that you cannot switch that 1 and 4 around because that 2 has to be multiplied by the 4. You can't switch it around. So it has to be 2x minus 1 and x plus 4. You can switch these parentheses around if you want, but you cannot switch the numbers inside. Let's look at this one here. Now, I look at this one. I need to have factors of negative 5, so I'm going to circle this and this because that's how my parentheses come out with. All right. Factors of negative 5. Oh, we're lucky on this one. We have 1 times negative 5 or positive 5 times a negative 1. Okay, so that's good. So we have to switch around. Now, but the only problem with this is, okay, I got probably a couple choices here, but now I have 6x squared. And when I say, how did I get 6x squared, I go, oh, it could be 6x and 1x. Or it could be 2x times 3x. So that's why guessing and checking, you have to think, oh, okay, so let's try. How about we just check, let's try 2x and 3x and see if we can make a 13 in the middle with the factors of negative 5. All right, so there's my 6x squared. I might have to change that, remember. I might have to change that. All right, so I look at this and I said, okay, let's just try 1 and negative 5, see if that works. So I'm going to do it like this. Now I got 6x squared, then this is a negative 10x plus 3x. That's negative 7. That's not going to give it to us. So we're going to try something different. How about we put a 5 here and a 1 here. See if that works. Okay, so I got 6x squared. Then I've got negative 2x plus 15x. There's our 13. That worked. Minus 5. So we were lucky. We only had to try 2 of them. I have done this before. Well, I've had to do it like 4 or 5 times because the 2 and 3x didn't work. I'd have to use 1 and 6. So we were lucky. The 2x and 3x was a good guess. That's why it's called trial and error. After you do these a while, you get better at guessing, but the problem is you always have to check and make sure that it really does work. You can't just guess it and say, okay, that's going to be it. You have to check and make sure it works. All right? All right, method 2. This is the one I really like, and I get to sing the hokey pokey with this, but we call this splitting in the middle. And I found this in a college textbook, so I know that they use this in colleges too. And this works with all factoring that we've done previously. You can use it with coefficients of 1 or not. I'm using the same 2 problems that we did before, so we already know the answer, all right? But we're going to use the method of splitting the middle. That's what we call it, all right? First, the steps. Let's write the steps down first, and then we'll practice them, and then you'll see how they work. We're going to multiply the leading coefficient and the last term. That's a little bit different. Then we're going to find 2 factors that add up to the middle term. That's the same. Then we're going to factor by grouping. All right? So let's try this. First thing I always do, I always like to sing the hokey pokey, so let's try this. We're going to put our first term down. We're going to put our last term down. And put our factors down and circle all about. So I've got to find factors. Now this is called splitting the middle because you're really going to split the middle. But I have to find factors of a negative 8 this time. This is different. You have to multiply the leading coefficient in last term. So we're going to take the 2 and multiply it by negative 4. That's how I get the negative 8. All right? Now I have to find factors of negative 8 that are going to give me a 7. So let's think about that so we don't have to go through a whole list. I think a positive 8 times a negative 1 will multiply to get negative 8 and add up to 7. All right? Now, all you do is once you find those terms, okay, those 2 terms, you bring them down here, and all you need to do is write the x there. So I can say plus 8x minus 1x. That's why it's called splitting the middle. I took that 7x and I split it this way. Now, you could have written the negative 1x first and the 8x second. It doesn't matter which way you write it. Just split the middle. Okay? So we've done step 1 and step 2. Now I want to factor by grouping. This is the fun part. But you have to look at it and say, okay, I have 2 terms here. So you're going to circle the first 2 terms here. And I want to see what they have in common. Eyeball. Look for your GCF. And I see that I'm going to take out a 2x out of there. All right? So I take a 2x out of there. When I do, I have x plus 4. All right? Now, I know I've got 2 more terms here. I know I have to have a factor of x plus 4. They have to match. So I look at that and say, what can I take out of negative 1x minus 4 that will give me a factor of x plus 4? And I can take out a negative 1. All right? I can factor out a negative 1. Now, look what I have. I have a term here. It's 2x times x plus 4, and I have a term here of negative 1 times x plus 4. Those 2 terms, I have an x plus 4 in common. So I'm going to factor out the x plus 4. So I'm going to take the x plus 4 right out. When I factor out the x plus 4, look what's left, a 2x and a minus 1. I just factored that by splitting the middle. So I took those. Now, when I do this the first time, everybody says, oh, there's way too many steps, I can't. I said, you know what? Doing this over and over again, you will never, ever have a problem with factoring ever again once you learn this. And we're going to practice more in class. So let's try another one. I'm going to get a different marker here so you can see it better. All right, so let's look at this one here. I've got 6x squared plus 13x minus 5. All right, we're going to split the middle. We're going to put the first term down, put the last term down, put my factors down. Now I have to do factors of a negative 30 over here at the side. Remember, I have to multiply these two together. That's the difference. Now, what am I going to use to get a 13? Well, you could do 1 times 30, 2 times 15, 3 times 10. Now, here's where I'm a little confused. Because if I look at this and say, oh, I could have 2 times 15. If I subtracted those two, I'd get a 13. Or here, if I added those two, I'd get a 13. You have to look at it. It's a negative 30. So you have to have one of the signs different. So I'm going to have to use this. And I'm going to call it plus 15 and a minus 2. So I put plus 15x minus 2x. See how I bring it over here? Now if you look at this, I have split the middle. I have my 6x squared here, my negative 5, and 15x minus 2x is 13. Right? Now I'm going to factor by grouping. Circle this one and look at what they have in common. And I see they have a 3 in common and an x. So I'm going to pull up 3x. So I have 2x plus 3. Excuse me, that's a 2x plus 5. Okay. Now here, I know I have to have 2x plus 5 again. What can I factor out of that? So I have a 2x plus 5, and that's going to be a negative 1. So let's look at this again. I have a term here with a 2x plus 5, a term here with a 2x plus 5. Let's take that 2x plus 5 out. And what's left over is going to be the 3x minus 1. This is what we came up before when we guessed and checked. That's splitting the middle. We'll practice that a lot more, and this is a very nice method. Okay. The last thing I'm going to show you is factoring completely, which takes a little bit of everything we learned earlier, and you're doing it all in once. And the key word here is completely. Notice I have an eyeball here because I always want you to check for the GCF first. And I really should have checked for the GCF first on all of those to see if there's anything I can take out to make it simpler. So let's look at this one right here. I have 3x squared minus 75. If I were to look at that carefully, I see I can take a 3 out of both those terms. So I'm going to put the 3 here with the parentheses. And when I do, I have x squared minus 25. That is factored, but it's not completely. So what we need to do now is I look at that and say, oh, that's my favorite one I learned. That is the difference of two perfect squares. So I'm going to put the 3 here, and I can write that as x plus 5 and x minus 5. Now I have factored that completely. Usually when they say completely, you're going to have a couple steps. Always check for your eyeball, do the GCF, and then make sure that that's out there to make it simpler for you to factor the rest. All right? Let's look at this one right here. I have x to the 4th minus 16. I look at my eyeball, GCF, I see nothing in common to take out, but I go, oh, it's one of those difference of two perfect squares. So I said, okay, how did I get x to the 4th? Well, that was x squared. How did I get negative 16? Oh, that was a 4, and it's plus minus. That's great. Now I look at it and said, okay, this is factored, but is it completely? And I look at this and say, oh, that's the difference of two perfect squares. This I can break down to x plus 2 and x minus 2. Here, it's x squared plus 4. That is the sum of two perfect squares. You cannot break that down anymore. I always sing MC Hammer, can't touch this. You can't touch that. It's not able to be factored, so that is as far as that goes. So you have x plus 2, x minus 2, x squared plus 4. Right? Let's look at this one down here. I did the first step first to kind of get us started. We have 6x cubed plus 24x squared minus 126x. And I looked at all three, and I see I could take a 6 out of all of them, and I can take at least one x out. So I did to make it more simpler, and look what I ended up with, x squared plus 4x minus 21, which is great because that's a lot easier to factor. Now the 6x is going to hang out while I factor that some more. And this one, I can do what we did before. How did I get the x squared? It was x and x. And now I have a negative 21. What factors are going to add up to 4? All right, so I think of it, I've got 1 times 21, 2 doesn't go in there, 3 times 7, oh, 3 times 7, and it's a positive 4, so a plus 7 and a minus 3. And I always check it, x squared plus 4x, excuse me, minus 3x plus 7x, there's my plus 4 minus 21. That's factored completely. But don't forget to bring the 6x down here. You need to have that with it. Okay. Let's look at this one here. If you'll notice, I have 15x cubed minus 5x squared minus 10x. Right? I looked at that. I could take a 5 and an x out of all of them, and it brings it down to 3x squared minus x minus 2. Now, I look at this, and the leading coefficient is a 1. So if you're comfortable, what I always tell my students to do is to, on the side, do splitting the middle. Or if you're good at trying to guess and check, you can guess and check. So I'm going to guess and check here, but you can certainly do this by splitting the middle. So I have a 3x and an x here, because that's how I got this. Now I have a negative 2, so I can have 2 and negative 1, or negative 2 and 1. So let's try, because I got to get a negative 1 here, so let's try putting a 2 here and a 1 here. I should make this negative and positive. Let's see how good I am at my guess and check. So I look at 3x squared minus 3x plus 2x. There's my negative x. I did it. Minus 2.